She had barely taken 2 careful steps across the polished hospital lobby before the doctor's voice cut through the room like the snap of a branch in winter. "Know your place, ma'am. The intensive care wing is not open for visitors dressed like that." Conversation stopped in mid-sentence. The rhythmic beeping from distant monitors suddenly seemed louder than before, echoing faintly through the vast military medical center, as dozens of eyes turned toward the elderly woman standing alone beneath the bright white lights. Her coat was old enough to have been repaired more times than replaced, its sleeves neatly stitched by patient hands, its faded fabric carrying the smell of fresh soap instead of expensive perfume. A pair of worn leather shoes rested carefully on the spotless floor, polished despite years of use. She clutched a small canvas bag against her chest as though it contained something far more precious than anything money could buy. Inside were only a folded photograph, a neatly wrapped loaf of homemade bread, and a handwritten letter whose edges had softened from being opened too many times. She did not look frightened. She simply looked tired in the quiet way that only comes from carrying grief for many years without asking anyone else to help lift it. Around her, families filled the waiting area with anxious whispers. Uniformed soldiers leaned against walls with slings around their shoulders. Children colored quietly beside exhausted mothers. Nurses crossed the marble floors with practiced urgency while announcements drifted overhead in calm mechanical voices. The hospital itself stood like a city devoted to healing, where thousands of stories crossed paths every week, some ending with celebration, others with unbearable loss. Dr. Nathan Mercer was known throughout the building as one of the finest trauma surgeons in the country. His hands had saved lives that few believed could be saved. His reputation reached military bases across the nation. Patients trusted him without hesitation. Administrators admired his discipline. Younger physicians wanted to become him. But beneath years of achievement lived a fatigue that had slowly hardened into impatience. 3 emergency surgeries, endless paperwork, and another sleepless night had left little room for compassion that morning. When he first noticed the elderly woman quietly approaching the reception desk instead of checking in through security, irritation arrived before curiosity. He never asked her name. He never asked whom she had come to see. He noticed only the patched coat, the weathered shoes, and the canvas bag that looked painfully out of place among polished briefcases and military uniforms. The receptionist tried gently to explain that the woman was asking for someone in intensive care, but Mercer interrupted before she could finish. "Visitors follow procedures here," he said sharply enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This isn't a shelter. If you're lost, security will help you find the exit." The words landed harder than he intended, but once spoken they could not be gathered back. A few people looked away, embarrassed on the woman's behalf. Others simply watched, uncertain whether to intervene. An elderly veteran sitting near the window lowered his newspaper without saying a word. A young corporal shifted uneasily in his wheelchair. Even the receptionist's smile disappeared. Yet the woman herself remained calm. She lifted gentle gray eyes toward the doctor, eyes that carried neither anger nor fear, only the quiet patience of someone who had survived far worse than humiliation. "I'm sorry if I've caused trouble," she said softly. "I only came because someone asked me to visit." Her voice was steady, almost comforting, as though she were trying to ease his burden instead of her own. Mercer sighed impatiently. "Everyone says that. Do you even know the patient's room number?" She hesitated. "No. I was told someone would meet me." He shook his head. "Then you shouldn't have come wandering into restricted areas. Know your place before you create problems for people already working under impossible pressure." The sentence hung heavily over the lobby. Somewhere behind them, an elevator opened with a quiet chime before closing again. The woman lowered her eyes for only a moment, then nodded politely. "Of course, Doctor. I didn't mean to interrupt your work." She turned without another word, taking slow, measured steps toward a row of wooden benches beside the memorial wall. Nobody stopped her. Nobody apologized. The waiting room gradually returned to its anxious rhythm, yet something invisible had changed. A young nurse named Lily Chin watched everything from the nurse's station. She had joined the hospital only 6 months earlier, still carrying the optimism that long careers sometimes eroded. There had been something unusual about the elderly visitor, something impossible to explain. Not importance exactly. Presence. The woman carried herself with remarkable grace despite obvious hardship, thanking a janitor who held a door, smiling gently at a frightened child, pausing to straighten a stack of abandoned magazines before sitting down. None of it seemed deliberate. Kindness simply appeared to be her natural language. Lily quietly filled a paper cup with water and walked across the lobby. "I thought you might like this," she said. The woman accepted it with genuine gratitude, as though receiving an extraordinary gift rather than ordinary kindness. "Thank you, dear. You've been very thoughtful." Lily noticed the woman's hands. They were rough from years of work yet astonishingly careful in every movement. As the woman reached into her coat pocket for a handkerchief, something briefly caught the nurse's attention. Hidden inside the coat lining was an old military service pin, nearly concealed beneath faded stitching, polished despite its age. Before Lily could ask about it, the woman gently tucked the fabric back into place. Across from the bench stood the hospital's memorial wall, engraved with hundreds of names honoring soldiers who had never returned home. Most visitors glanced at it for only a second before continuing down the corridor. The elderly woman rose slowly and approached it as though greeting old friends. Her fingers hovered just above several names without touching them. Her lips moved silently, not in conversation but remembrance. Tears never appeared. Whatever sorrow lived inside her had long ago become too deep for tears alone. Lily watched from a distance, sensing that interrupting such a moment would somehow be disrespectful. Minutes passed. Dr. Mercer disappeared into another emergency consultation. Stretchers rolled through hallways. Helicopters landed on the rooftop. Life continued inside the enormous building exactly as it always had. Yet the woman remained beside the wall, quietly studying each engraved name with extraordinary familiarity. When she finally returned to her bench, she carefully removed the folded photograph from her canvas bag. It showed a young soldier smiling beside a simple farmhouse beneath an enormous oak tree. The edges had faded from decades of handling. She brushed invisible dust from its surface with remarkable tenderness before returning it to the bag. At that same moment, outside the hospital entrance, 3 dark military vehicles pulled sharply to the curb. Their arrival drew immediate attention from security officers stationed near the doors. Uniformed military police stepped out first, scanning the entrance before opening the rear door of the lead vehicle. A tall officer emerged wearing 4 silver stars across his shoulders. Conversations throughout the lobby gradually faded into silence once again as soldiers instinctively straightened their posture. Even those who did not recognize him immediately understood from the reactions around them that someone of extraordinary rank had just arrived. Without hesitation, the 4-star general entered the lobby with determined strides, his eyes searching every corner of the room before settling on the nearest receptionist. His voice remained calm, but every syllable carried unmistakable urgency. "I'm looking for Mrs. Eleanor Brooks. Has she arrived yet?" The receptionist looked toward the quiet woman sitting alone beside the memorial wall, and before she could answer, Dr. Mercer stepped back into the lobby just in time to see the general remove his cap, his expression filled not with authority but with profound respect as he began walking directly toward the woman he had dismissed only moments before. The lobby remained so still that even the soft humming of the air conditioning seemed louder than the dozens of people standing motionless beneath the bright hospital lights. Dr. Nathan Mercer followed the general's line of sight, expecting him to stop beside a decorated officer or a visiting dignitary. Instead, the 4-star general walked past every polished uniform without hesitation until he reached the elderly woman sitting quietly beside the memorial wall. Before anyone could understand what they were witnessing, the general removed his gloves, stood perfectly straight, and offered the kind of salute reserved for the deepest respect. Then, to the astonishment of everyone in the room, he lowered his hand and gently took Eleanor Brooks's weathered hands into his own. "Mrs. Brooks," he said with unmistakable warmth, "I have been hoping you made it safely. Thank you for coming." The words struck the lobby harder than any shouted command. Nurses froze in place. Receptionists exchanged bewildered glances. The military police standing near the entrance instinctively relaxed, realizing their urgent search had ended. Dr. Mercer felt something unfamiliar settle into the pit of his stomach. Confusion came first. Then discomfort. Then the slow, unmistakable awareness that he had judged someone before learning a single true thing about her. Eleanor smiled with the same quiet kindness she had shown everyone else that morning. "I'm sorry if I caused such a fuss, General. I didn't mean for anyone to worry." The General shook his head gently. "The only thing that worried us was the thought that we might have failed to welcome you properly." His eyes drifted briefly across the room, taking in the uncomfortable faces of the staff. He noticed the untouched paper cup in Eleanor's hand. He noticed the faint redness around the receptionist's eyes. Most of all, he noticed the expression on Dr. Mercer's face. It was the expression of a man beginning to realize that the ground beneath his certainty had shifted. Before the silence could become unbearable, Lily stepped quietly beside Eleanor. "Are you all right, Mrs. Brooks?" Eleanor smiled. "Thanks to your kindness, dear, I am. You were the first person who looked at me instead of through me." Those words landed softly, yet they carried more weight than any accusation could have. Lily lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the praise, while several employees remembered how easily they had watched the earlier humiliation without saying a word. The General turned toward Mercer, though his voice remained measured rather than angry. "Doctor, may I borrow a few minutes of your time?" Mercer nodded automatically. "Of course." They moved into a nearby consultation room where the glass walls overlooked the memorial courtyard. Mercer expected criticism. Instead, the General rested both hands on the table and spoke with remarkable restraint. "Dr. Mercer, I know your reputation. I've read reports describing surgeries that saved men who should never have survived. The country owes you gratitude." Mercer remained silent. "But today, the finest surgeon in this hospital forgot something no medical school can teach. Every patient, every visitor, every stranger carries a story invisible to the eye." Mercer looked toward the floor. "I made an assumption." "Yes," the General replied quietly. "And assumptions are often the sharpest knives because they leave wounds no skin can detect." Mercer wanted to defend himself. He wanted to explain the exhaustion, the impossible schedule, the constant emergencies. Yet every explanation sounded smaller than the memory of his own words. "Know your place." He heard them again inside his mind, now stripped of irritation and revealed for what they truly were. Across the hallway, Eleanor slowly walked beside the memorial wall once more. She paused before one particular name, gently touching the cold stone with trembling fingertips. Lily approached carefully but said nothing. The older woman seemed to belong to the silence itself. For nearly a full minute neither of them spoke. The hallway filled only with distant footsteps, elevator chimes, and the muted rhythm of heart monitors somewhere beyond the intensive care unit. It was the kind of silence that carried memories instead of emptiness. Finally Eleanor whispered, "They were all someone's whole world." Lily followed her gaze across the endless rows of engraved names. "Did you know many of them?" Eleanor answered with a faint smile that carried both pride and sorrow. "More than I ever wished to." Before Lily could ask another question, the General joined them, standing quietly beside Eleanor. He did not interrupt her reflection. Instead, he looked toward the wall himself. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the respect usually reserved for history itself. Most people believe these names were honored only by medals and ceremonies. They weren't. Many of the families standing after those losses are standing because of her. Lily frowned gently, uncertain she understood. The General turned toward the nurse. Years ago, after losing her husband in combat, Mrs. Brooks quietly began helping military widows complete paperwork that nobody else understood. She drove hundreds of miles to deliver food. She paid utility bills anonymously whenever she could. She convinced retired volunteers to repair homes for disabled veterans. She spent decades doing work that never appeared in newspapers because she believed gratitude should never ask for applause. Eleanor looked almost embarrassed by the attention. "It wasn't only me. Many people helped." The General smiled softly. "They helped because you showed them how." Dr. Mercer had followed them into the hallway just in time to hear every word. He stood completely still as pieces of a story he had never imagined slowly assembled before him. The patched coat was not evidence of neglect but of deliberate simplicity. The homemade bread inside the canvas bag was for a wounded soldier with no nearby family. The photograph she carried belonged to her late husband, whose name was engraved only a few feet away on the memorial wall. The military pin hidden inside her coat had never been displayed because she believed sacrifice belonged to those who served, not those left behind. Mercer felt shame settle deeper than embarrassment. It reached places accomplishment had never touched. The general continued, unaware that nearly the entire lobby had gathered quietly within earshot. 20 years ago, Congress approved the Veterans Emergency Family Support Initiative. Thousands of military families have survived impossible moments because of it. Scholarships, temporary housing, emergency childcare, grief counseling, transportation for wounded soldiers' parents. Every administrator knows the program. Very few know whose determination made it possible. He looked directly at Eleanor. She spent 12 years writing letters after midnight until someone finally listened. The hallway remained completely silent. Mercer noticed tears in the eyes of veterans who rarely showed emotion. One elderly man removed his cap. A young Marine missing one leg straightened in his wheelchair. Staff members who had rushed past Eleanor earlier now seemed unable to meet her eyes. Then came the revelation that transformed every expression in the building. The general spoke not as an officer delivering information but as a son remembering a debt that could never be repaid. 21 years ago, my father returned from deployment with injuries that ended his military career. My mother had nothing. We were days away from losing our home. Before any government assistance arrived, before anyone knew our names, someone knocked on our front door carrying groceries, blankets, and enough money to keep our lights on. My mother asked who had sent her. The woman simply smiled and said, "Another military family already paid this kindness forward." He looked at Eleanor with quiet gratitude. "That woman was you." A single tear escaped Lily's eye. Mercer closed his own for just a moment. Every title he had earned suddenly felt insignificant beside a lifetime of unseen compassion. Eleanor gently reached for the general's arm. "Your mother did the same for others later. That's how kindness survives. It refuses to stay with the first person who receives it." The general nodded. Then he turned toward everyone gathered in the hallway. "There is one more thing all of you deserve to know. The wounded veteran Mrs. Brooks came to visit today personally requested only one visitor before his next surgery. He didn't ask for a commanding officer. He didn't ask for a decorated hero. He asked for the woman who had quietly written to him every month since he lost both legs overseas because, in his words, she never allowed him to believe his life had ended when his service did." The realization spread through the crowd like sunrise breaking over a dark landscape. The woman dismissed for looking ordinary had carried extraordinary dignity all along. Dr. Mercer finally stepped forward, but before he could find the courage to speak, Eleanor looked at him with the same gentle expression she had worn from the beginning, leaving him to confront not her anger, but the far heavier burden of undeserved grace. Dr. Nathan Mercer had prepared himself for anger, for public condemnation, perhaps even for the quiet satisfaction of seeing his reputation collapse under the weight of his own mistake. Instead, Eleanor Brooks looked at him with the same gentle eyes that had thanked a young nurse for a simple cup of water and smiled at a frightened child in the waiting room. There was no triumph in her expression, no resentment. Only an unmistakable kindness that somehow made the silence harder to bear than any accusation ever could. Mercer stepped forward slowly, feeling every pair of eyes in the hallway resting on him. For the first time in many years, the surgeon who always knew exactly what to say found himself searching for words that refused to come. His voice, when it finally emerged, was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "Mrs. Brooks, I judged you before I knew you. I looked at your clothes instead of your character. I looked at your appearance instead of your purpose. I spoke to you in a way no person deserves to be spoken to. I am deeply sorry." The apology echoed softly through the corridor, not because it was loud, but because it was completely unguarded. There was no excuse hidden inside it. No explanation offered to soften responsibility. It was simply the truth. Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, not as someone deciding whether forgiveness should be granted, but as someone trying to understand the heart standing before her. Then she smiled, and the years seemed to soften across her face like morning light settling over quiet fields. Doctor, every one of us has looked at someone and believed we understood their story. Most of us are fortunate enough to discover our mistake in private. Yours simply happened where others could see it. Mercer lowered his eyes. I don't know how to make this right. You already have, she answered gently. You admitted the truth before anyone forced you to. That is where every real change begins. The 4-star general watched the exchange without interruption. He had witnessed acts of courage on battlefields across the world, but this kind of courage was different. It required no weapon, no strategy, no uniform. It demanded only humility, and humility was often rarer than bravery. The hallway slowly filled with movement again as doctors returned to patients and nurses resumed their rounds, yet something fundamental had shifted inside the building. Conversations became quieter. Faces softened. Staff members who had hurried past visitors without making eye contact now paused to offer directions or simply ask whether someone needed help. It was as though one small moment had reminded everyone why hospitals existed in the first place. Eleanor finally turned toward the intensive care unit. The young soldier waiting inside had suffered devastating injuries during a rescue mission overseas. Months earlier, he had confessed in one of his letters that he feared becoming a burden to everyone who loved him. Eleanor had answered every letter by hand, filling each page with ordinary stories about gardens blooming after harsh winters, children learning to ride bicycles, neighbors helping one another after storms, and veterans who had rebuilt meaningful lives despite unimaginable loss. She never filled the pages with grand speeches. She filled them with reasons to believe tomorrow deserved another chance. When she entered his room, the machines continued their steady rhythm while sunlight spilled through the window onto the neatly folded flag resting on a nearby shelf. The young soldier's face brightened the instant he saw her. You came, he whispered, his voice weak but unmistakably joyful. I promised I would, Eleanor replied, taking his hand as though greeting an old friend instead of someone she had met only through letters. I brought you fresh bread, though I suspect the nurses won't let you eat it just yet. A faint laugh escaped him. The sound was small, but everyone standing outside the room heard it. Some smiled without realizing they were smiling. Others quietly wiped away tears. Dr. Mercer remained near the doorway, watching a woman with no medical degree accomplish something no surgery could provide. She gave the young man hope, and hope was beginning to look like a form of healing all its own. Hours later, after the soldier had been taken into surgery, Mercer found Lily reviewing patient charts at the nurse's station. He thanked her for showing kindness when he had failed to do so. Lily seemed surprised. I almost didn't walk over with that cup of water, she admitted. I was afraid I might be interrupting something. Mercer nodded thoughtfully. Compassion often arrives disguised as something very small. We should never underestimate it again. Within weeks, quiet changes began spreading through the hospital. They did not come through dramatic speeches or mandatory seminars. They began with one simple practice suggested by Mercer himself. Every new employee, from surgeons to custodians, spent part of their first day listening to stories from patients, veterans, and families instead of studying policies alone. They learned names before titles. They learned histories before assumptions. They learned that every person entering those doors carried invisible burdens that deserved the same careful attention as visible wounds. Near the hospital entrance, beside the memorial wall where Eleanor had stood that unforgettable morning, a small bronze plaque was installed. It contained no mention of the public misunderstanding and no reference to anyone's mistake. It bore only a single sentence chosen by Eleanor herself. Respect should never wait for a resume. Visitors paused to read those words every day. Some nodded thoughtfully before continuing down the corridor. Others carried them home without realizing it. Months later, Dr. Mercer received an envelope with familiar handwriting. Inside was a short note from Eleanor. She thanked him for the care he had given the young soldier, who was now learning to walk with advanced prosthetics, and had begun mentoring newly injured veterans. At the bottom of the page she had written one final sentence. The strongest hearts are not the ones that never fail. They are the ones that choose kindness after discovering they were wrong. Mercer folded the letter carefully, and placed it inside his desk drawer beside photographs of patients whose lives had marked his own. Of every award he had ever received, none reminded him more clearly of the physician he hoped to become. A year after that remarkable morning, Eleanor returned to the hospital once again. This time no military escort announced her arrival. No crowd gathered. She entered quietly through the same front doors carrying another homemade loaf of bread in the same weathered canvas bag. The receptionist greeted her by name before she reached the desk. Nurses smiled as they passed. Patients who had never met her somehow sensed the calm she carried with her. Dr. Mercer met her in the lobby, not with ceremony, but with genuine warmth. They walked together to the memorial wall where fresh flowers rested beneath the engraved names. For several minutes neither of them spoke. They simply stood in grateful silence, remembering those whose sacrifices had made every ordinary day possible. As Eleanor prepared to leave, she glanced back one final time at the busy hospital filled with strangers whose stories had yet to be told. She smiled quietly, knowing that dignity had taken root there in ways no one could fully measure. The doors closed gently behind her, and life inside the hospital continued much as it always had, except that people looked at one another a little longer before passing judgment, spoke a little softer before raising their voices, and listened a little more carefully before deciding what another person deserved. Because the truest measure of a life is never the rank on a shoulder, the title on a door, or the clothes someone wears, but the quiet kindness they leave behind when no one thinks to applaud it. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone who still believes that the smallest act of respect can change a life, because the people who appear ordinary are often carrying the most extraordinary stories, and sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones the world almost walks past.